The Ohio State football team, Pat, obviously you work for Bucknuts. You're out there. You cover the team a lot. It's hard for the Ohio State football team to do anything quietly, but I feel like they kind of did yesterday with this hiring of Josh Boyer as a defensive analyst, former defensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins. But more importantly, though, he has a past with Matt Patricia, as they were both on staff together for the New England Patriots for a long time. What can you tell us? What do you know? This kind of happened, like I said, middle of the day yesterday out of nowhere. What do we know about Josh Boyer?
Yeah, as you mentioned, worked with Matt Patricia, was with the Patriots for a while there. They won three Super Bowls, together. So good pedigree. I don't think you'll turn down a guy who has that kind of experience. And then, as you mentioned, was working with the Miami Dolphins as the pass game coordinator and then the defensive coordinator. So another guy on the staff, connections back to Ohio, being from Heath, as we talked about, and the experience in the NFL, which I won't say Ryan Day prioritizes, but I don't think he turns his nose up to that. Obviously, going after Matt Patricia. Tim Walton was coaching in the NFL before he came back. Ryan Day obviously came from a couple years in the NFL. So I think this is a guy who, it's odd timing right before the season starts, but if he steps into, let's say, like an analyst role where he's just breaking things down at first, really doesn't matter. He can kind of slowly work his way into, if he's going to get to know the guys, help on field, those type of things. So I think it makes sense, especially given the Matt Patricia connection. And I think one of the things Ryan Day's recognized with the expanded staffs that they now have is sort of that Nick Saban approach of like, look, if you're not out there doing something, or if you need to sort of rehab your image a little bit in the eyes of other football people, come here and let's do that at Ohio State, right? Alabama was doing that time and time again, whether it was a full-time position or like these analysts and stuff. He had tons of those guys on staff. And I think Ryan Day, he's referenced how Nick Saban has done things a couple times over the last year or so. And, I think he recognized, especially with the talent on last year's team, like, let's look at what this guy who won all those national championships did. And so I think he's taken things here or there that he thinks work for this program.
I think this hire is big for two reasons, and you touched on them both a little bit. But Matt Patricia came in here, and he inherited a defensive staff, right? And Tim Walton, great. Matt Guerreri, great. James Laurinaitis, Laurinaitis, we already know, him very well. Larry Johnson. But Matt Patricia didn't really have any of his guys. This is a guy in Boyer who he has a relationship with. He can bring in, can be another guy maybe we'll look at it kind of the same way that Patricia does, as someone that he can rely on and trust. Not that he doesn't trust those other guys. Sure. He just doesn't have that previous working relationship. And we saw how that worked last year for Ryan Day with Chip Kelly. Now, I'm not saying Josh Boyer is Chip Kelly, but Ryan Day, when he had Chip Kelly here, he had a guy that he trusted implicitly, someone that he knew he didn't have to worry about, someone that could look at the game maybe the same way he does, see certain things and whatnot. And I think that was so huge. And I think that's one thing that's kind of concerning for the Buckeyes this year is the loss of Chip Kelly and Ryan Day having that guy that he could really rely on. The second thing that you touched on is having these NFL guys. And the college game has never been closer to the NFL now than it is. And the playoff last year, and you started to hear this from Ohio State early on in training camp. They talked about 16 games the whole time. Their goal was 16 games. In this playoff type format, you need guys that have done a playoff type format. Right. And that's so important last year. Ryan's been in the NFL before. Chip Kelly had been in the NFL. You mentioned Tim Walton. You needed these guys to rely on that NFL experience. I think when you have a guy that has that on your coaching staff now, it's more important than ever in college football.
And I think another thing when you have guys that have worked in the NFL is, and you mentioned NFL or college football is more like the NFL. Well, now these guys are getting paid, right? Yeah. And there's balancing that in the locker room and things like that you didn't really have to worry. There's egos, and as a college coach, you have to make sure your guys are all on your same page and whatnot. But now with the money aspect and just handling all of that, and okay, how do we want to how do we want to build? We don't have unlimited funds, right? Even though people think Ohio State and whatnot. But how do we want to assign that? What positions are we prioritizing? Things like that. And Matt Patricia's had to deal with some of that in the NFL. Ryan Day had to deal with some of that in the NFL, right? And now you bring in another guy who has some experience. And not to say that that's going to be a big thing. Obviously, it's Mark Pantoni that handles a lot of kind of roster management stuff. But that's all just another advantage you have with some of these NFL guys who have that experience.
That's a great point out of you. The other thing I like with this, listen, Ohio State, we're in the era of NIL and transfer portal, and I feel like Ohio State has been a model program with that. Like, let's fill holes where we need, and then if we get an elite talent that could fall into our laps, like a Caleb Downs, like a Julian Sayin, like a Max Clare, let's strike on that. But let's really use it to fill holes and needs.
Yeah.
And then all this other stuff is bonus. And they've still tried to be a college football program where you get guys that want to be at Ohio State no matter what. They want to grow as Buckeyes into that role. And Ohio State is doing that on their coaching staff too, right? You've got Brian Hartline and James Laurinaitis and Tim Walton, guys who played here.
Yes.
Then you've got Ohio guys around this team. And when I look at other guys on the staff like a Tim Hinton and an Ed Terwilliger, who helps deal with the high school relations of everything,
right,
who was a longtime coach at Olentangy. Boyer coming in as a guy from Heath, played at Muskingum. I think it's important to have guys that know the history, know the tradition, and want to be here on your coaching staff to help convey that to your players.
Absolutely. I think we were talking about it, Brandon and I, this week about James Laurinaitis and how he's teaching these linebackers the history of Ohio State, which some of them grew up in Ohio, so some of them know more of that. But they're young, right? And that's what he said was like, these guys don't know. Randy Gradishar was the example he used, like that cold tub video they put out this week of the Mount Rushmore and guys going around. And Edric Houston, he's like, you don't know who Randy Gradishar is, do you? And he's like, I'm 19, coach. And it's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Unless, you grew up a Buckeye fan and that's, you've paid attention to the history. These guys only know what they've seen, or the guys that are, pictured on the walls when you walk in. And there are, not to say that there aren't the legends up there, the older guys, but I like that James Laurinaitis, an Ohio guy, or, an Ohio State guy, not an Ohio guy, who cared about learning that because Jim Tressel did that when he was here, is now passing that along to the linebackers and allowing them to learn the legacy that they are stepping into or have already stepped into. Tim Walton, again, same way. Brian Hartline. You asked Brian Hartline about the past at Ohio State. He's well aware. Like, he makes sure his guys know. And, obviously the wide receiver room has grown tremendously under him. But there's some really good ones in the past, too. And he makes sure his guys know about that. So I think it's all, a good... Ryan Day has figured out, there may have been some growing pains early on with some of the staffing. I think he's figured out a really good way to build this in terms of, I want some of this and some of this and some of this. And it makes, obviously, winning a national championship, it all came together the right way. And now, you had to change some things, but I think it still makes a lot of sense.
And I think hard to argue that Ohio State, if not the best coaching staff in the country, one of the top 2 or 3.
Sure.
And the results were there, obviously, last year with the national championship. Speaking of the defensive side of the ball, Buckeye defense was great last year. Could this year's be as good or maybe even better? We'll discuss next.